Francisco Villaverde, automation engineer at Intermedia, right?
Yes, that's right.
What is an automation engineer?
Wow.
Thought it
I
was going to
actually
be
did
more
a
technical.
yeah. I did a talk about this subject a few months ago. So an automation engineer takes care of automated testing in a QA team. I mean, there used to be like testers that were focused on engineering and automation. I'm sorry, but now it's sort of expected that a tester is able to do like everything. So automation engineer just sort of covers most of the areas of QA testing that are not directly related to manual testing. So it's UI testing, it's API testing, it's a lot of different technical aspects of testing that are not manual. So that's basically what an automation engineer does.
So what's the added value of manual testing, particularly now in times of AI? I assume that this is also, I don't know, it's also affecting the testing sector. What is? I imagine that this is gourmet is not the word, but it's sort of boutique. Like you like manual testing is like something
yeah.
that is. What? How does it affect it? What's the added value of a manual tester?
So manual testing is it's not going away anytime soon. Mainly because the products that even the AI builds, those products are being used by humans, and AI it's not really testing. You can't really simulate how a human is going to interact with an application, how it's gonna measure its attractiveness, how it's gonna find it in a usability setting. I mean, there's a lot of things that an AI simply can't do. And also, automation doesn't cover everything. I mean, it's impossible to cover the whole testing spectrum because there are some things that just a computer can do, or if a computer can do it, I mean, it's too complex to program it. So it's not really cost effective. So manual testing is not going away anytime soon. And
So
there's things that a manual tester is going to find that no machine is ever going to find. I'm sure about that.
But
Yeah.
when you mention that the AI can't predict how humans are going to interact, is it because we're so unpredictable? Like what is the factor that makes it so? I mean, aren't we really predictable in some sense? Do you not think that that's the case?
I would like to say that humans are predictable, but they are often not because the way I see it, or I found that many applications that you're expecting people to use them a certain way,
Yeah.
and somebody comes up with this use case that is completely out there, like it's totally nuts, and it sort of crashes your application and just destroys everything. And you can ask, I mean, any video game tester, for example, and players often find things that are completely out there, like wild stuff, and they just destroy your application. And there's no way an AI can pick up on that. You can't simulate that type of creative and sort of unpredictable behavior. You can't do it. I mean, it's impossible to program that. You can't be done. So
That's refreshing. That's refreshing.
yeah,
So
yeah, it is.
thank you for that. You added like a layer of calm. So you mentioned gaming or gaming testing. Are you a gamer yourself? Yes.
Yes, I am. I
What games do you
unfortunately,
play?
yeah, I play a lot of things. I play mostly role playing games, action games, and I like also simulator games like city planning games like SimCity and stuff like that, where you have to build and manage a city. I love those games. I don't know why. It just sort of brings me it calms me down because there's so much things in life that you can't control, but suddenly in a game you can control a whole city, and it's like, oh, so refreshing. It's like really therapeutical.
I have a 10-year-old that downloaded Sims the other day, and he was like, dude, like this is I have to pay taxes. Yeah. Like,
Yes.
why would you even play that?
Yeah.
Like, why would you play a game? And he was like, no,
Yeah.
but it's good. I have money, and
Well,
he really likes it too. I don't see the
I don't
like. I
know.
am
I don't know what
really
it is.
illiterate.
I don't know what it is, but yes, simulator games and especially especially those things that are like simulating the real world. Those things that sort of bring you some kind of peace that I don't know. I don't know how it's. I don't know how that works. I don't know what it is, but it's there.
And when you mentioned role playing games, is that also online, or is that like what games are we talking about? I'm really
Um.
illiterate in gaming, so I'm
Okay.
gonna ask you some questions that you're gonna think are stupid, but
No. No.
I have
No. It's
no
okay.
idea. Like when you
Um.
mention role play, I think about cards
Yeah.
or
I
board
mean,
games.
yes. Board games, role play. Yeah, role play cards come in very different flavors. There are card games that can be seen as role playing games. There are board games that are seen as role playing games, and even like the original godfather of role playing games, it's a board game. It's Dungeons and Dragons.
Dungeons and
And
Dragons.
yeah, and it's a board game, but video games have role playing games as well, where you have a character and your character has certain skills and he grows in a certain way and all that, and you make decisions and your decisions affect the story and everything, and that is a role playing game. And then that can be played in almost any platform, any modern platform can be played a game. Like in your mobile phone, you can play it in a PlayStation or on your PC or whatever. Or you can get together with your friends and play a role playing game. That's also something I used to do. I don't do it that often now because most of my friends and me, we don't have the time for that. But yeah,
But do you
role
play
playing games
online?
can. Yeah, there's a couple of games that I play online with my friends. But mostly I like to play on my own because I can like sort of go on my own pace, and I don't have like uh, so many. You have to take into account a lot of people, and you have to sort of
Yeah, it's a
make.
scheduling conflict,
Yeah,
I
it's a
can imagine.
scheduling thing. Yeah, it's yeah. I
So
usually prefer to play on my own. Yeah.
which ones, for example, which role playing games do you play online and which platforms?
Well, online we're playing now one that is called Baldur's Gate 3. That it's sort of exploded a couple of months ago, and it's really popular now. And on my own, I usually play like Final Fantasy games. There are Japanese role playing games, which are very good. They're very very good. And my favorite of all time, I would have to say, is Mass Effect. That's a Western RPG that is called like it's made in the West, like United States company made it, so it's called Western. But yeah,
What's
that's sort of my
RPG?
favorites. RPG is role playing game.
Ah,
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't. They're
it
sort
was
of
pretty obvious. I was like trying
yeah,
to
it's
say it in my brain. RPG is it?
yeah,
Right. So I have a question, right? Because you study linguistics.
yes, I do.
So I don't know about the games that you play, but I read in preparing for this interview, since yeah, I was going to speak to somebody who was a gamer and I'm not. I was
Hmm.
reading that some games have sort of fictional worlds with unique languages inside. Is that the case in any of the games that you play?
Yeah, most games that I play usually have some sort of made up language that you have to that well in many cases you usually have like a direct translation inside the game, like the language appears for a brief moment and there is immediately translated to English or whatever language you're using. But yeah, and it's actually quite common in every fantasy world, or especially fantasy. I'm not going to say science fiction because science fiction is trickier, but fantasy worlds usually have made up languages, and some of them are really intricate. Like Game of Thrones has a lot of has like two big languages that were made from the ground up. And well, any game or movie of Lord of the Rings also that has a made up languages. And Tolkien had this fascination with human language, and he created Elvish and Dwarfish and all that. He created it up from scratch using bits and pieces of other languages, yes, but he made it up. So yeah, that's actually pretty common, I would say. Yeah.
So how do you think you don't do this, obviously, I think, but how do you imagine that these languages are created, and what do you think the role of linguistics is? Like you said, okay, Tolkien was a fan of languages, and
Yeah.
so he invented them. But what do you think the role of linguistics is in the creation of a whole language? Like I know in other movies, like you said, right? Like there's what is it? There's a language that like it's Klingon. Is that it?
Oh yeah, Star Trek. Yes. Yeah.
The people actually like state that they speak it, as if
Yes.
it were a real life language.
There are, as I recall, there are like 40 native speakers of Klingon. Native meaning that they learned the language when they were kids. Like their parents taught them Klingon, and they learned to speak Klingon by hearing their parents. There are like 40 people in the entire world that do that. Yeah,
Do you
it's
speak
incredible.
Klingon?
Of course not. No.
You're not one of those
No.
40 native speakers.
No, I'm not.
But where is Klingon from? Because it's not from anything that you mentioned.
No, it's from Star Trek.
From Star Trek. Okay.
Yeah, the old TV series. If I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what's the role, or what do you imagine is the role of linguistics in the creation of this? I imagine that it's a really creative process. And you mentioned today that there is an inspiration, I assume.
Yes. I mean, every made up language starts from somewhere. I mean, it's very hard for you to completely distance yourself from existing languages altogether. But well, linguistics is basically the study of human language, spoken or gestures. Diphthongs are also part of linguistics. So all that, when you're making up a language, you have to start from basically the ground up, and the ground is phonetics. That's the base of everything. What sounds are you going to use? You're going to use how many vowels, how many consonants, stuff like that. And from that, you have to start with morphology. How are your verbs going to be in infinitive? Like, what are going to be the terminations or the prefixes or the suffixes or what you're going to use? Then it's syntax and how you're going to join two words together, and then you can move on to vocabulary and stuff like that. But so I would say that linguistics is like the most important thing when you're going to invent a language. So yeah, I mean, you can use like many different strategies that are completely documented and studied and perfectly, they can be read by anybody, in a dictionary, in a grammar book or whatever. You can use different rules from English, from Japanese, from whatever, from Klingon, even if you feel like it. Yeah. So
Have
yeah,
you ever
linguistics
created
is
a
very
language?
important. No. I mean, it's very, very hard to invent a language. I mean, once you start studying like a human language like English or Spanish or whatever, when you really start to study and you see the intricacies of it, like how many suffixes do we have, how many prepositions do we have, and all stuff. I mean, you can go crazy studying that, and you can go crazy like imagining like inventing something like that. It's impossible to invent something like that. I mean, it's never going to be like a natural language.
Yeah.
It's never going to be like that. But you can get close. I mean, you can get really close. I mean, there are a couple of tongues that were invented by men, like Esperanto, for example, and that it's a made up language, and it still has native speakers. I mean, there's thousands of speakers of Esperanto, not that many.
Yeah.
I mean, most natural
That
tongues
didn't
are
work.
spoken. Yeah. I mean, most natural languages are spoken by millions and millions of people, but there are examples of artificial languages that were successful in their own way. You know.
Do you think that this is going to change now in the advent of generative AI? Do you think it's going to be easier? Is this something? Because I can imagine that this could be really hard work for a person to sit down and create a whole language from scratch. Do you think that this is something that could be easier with AI?
You know, I hadn't thought of that before, but it's interesting because I don't think that I don't think so because where we stand right now, uh, language models don't really work the same way that natural language work. I mean, we we process syntax in a very strange way. I mean, computers usually do like sequential thinking, you know. So if you put a word, then the computer can do really fast at a speed that is unimaginable. He can predict what's the most common word that's going to follow another word and so
Okay.
create sentences, right? But we don't do that. We do something that is more chaotic, if you will. I mean, we go forwards, we go backwards, and we can create meaning from context. I mean, it's a whole different game. So creating a language from scratch, like a computer can obviously help you do that. I mean, that's undoubtedly so, but just creating something out of the blue, I don't know. I don't think so. I hope it's not the case, but you know, I don't know.
I've heard of people of writers, for
Mm.
example, using AI to help them create fantasy worlds in a really good way, right? Like not so
Mhm.
much the script that sometimes if you have like the plot, then maybe it's not that imaginative or it falls in sort of, sort of common areas that are not, very creative or they've been done before. But I've heard people tell me, like, I test my, for example, I say science fiction or maybe
Mhm.
even like a fantasy world like this, right? Like, that it helps them to create the thing according to the laws. For example, what are the laws of physics going to be in this place that you created? And is this consistent with what you're saying? No, and trying
Yes.
to sort of create that. And in that case, as an assistant for that, people are saying that it's really, really useful because that's what's most difficult for us. Like you can have the plot or whatever, but then like when you have to create the whole scenario and make it consistent throughout the whole book, then
Hmm.
sometimes,
Yeah.
sometimes it's flying, you're flying, but then in another scene you're not floating and that doesn't make sense, or I don't know. Yeah, and so that it
I
helps them
understand.
sort of test consistency in that sense.
Yeah.
Is real-time translation a thing in games, in online gaming? Is it used or not really?
Uh, no, but I would imagine that is not going to be very far. I mean, you can do it like with your cell phone, you know, like Google Lens and stuff like that. And you can take pictures of letters, and Google will translate it for you. So AI can do that much faster. So I would imagine that interpreters and live translation, that's going to be, yeah, I think that those people are going to get, they're going to be out of a job pretty soon, unfortunately. So, and, you know, I don't really have, I don't really have a hopeful message about that. I mean, there's a lot of people like, I think that translators are like one of the first, I think that's one of the first jobs that are going to be out the window. So yeah, I mean, it's not really good, but it's what it is.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not looking good on that. But what do you think the role of language learning is? A couple of well, last week I was in a summit for the Futures Committee, and
Hmm.
I heard a guy from Meta, right, and he was talking about simultaneous translation and how it wasn't going to take anyone's job because the context and blah blah, and then
Hmm.
I met him when we were having lunch and I was like, yeah, I don't think that's going to happen, right? Like, and he was like, no, well, the context. I'm like, the context now, but in 5 years, I mean, what's going to
Yeah.
happen with that? And he said Well, yeah, but I think, and I was like, I have language school and I teach English. Like, what do you think the role of language learning is? And he said, well, I think the role of language learning in one sense is one thing, and role of learning English is something else, right? And what's your take on that? Like, is it worth learning a language anymore? And if it is, what for? And you know,
You're sort of barking on the wrong tree, because I think that learning languages has a value like beyond being functional. I mean, I know I
okay,
learned English. I started studying English like when I was 6, because my parents thought, yeah, this is going to be useful, so let's make him study English. But I also want to learn other languages just because I'm curious about them, not because I'm going to use them. And I am fully aware that learning a new language, especially when you're young, is much easier, but it also flexes your brain in a way that no other thing can do. I mean, I've met people like linguists and that speak like 8 languages, and they have a way of thinking that it's completely beyond what a monolingual person can imagine. I mean, I'm a bilingual person, and I think I have some ways of thinking that are not restricted to Spanish. I can think in English most of the times when I'm writing something that, like science fiction. Science fiction to me is in English. I mean, I can't imagine writing science fiction in Spanish. So when I imagine that, I think in English. And I think that that is irreplaceable. And that has nothing to do with if language is going to be useful for you, if you're going to need it because there's live translations or whatever. And I think that learning languages is by its own a great activity and very good for the mind, just for your thought process and how you learn. I mean, other things. I mean, that it doesn't have anything to do with if it works for you, or if it's gonna if it's gonna help you get a job or whatever. So yeah, I think that language learning is, I would say, it's not going anywhere. I think it doesn't make any sense to get rid of it at all.
oh, that's good.
But that's my
Let
opinion.
people, yeah,
I
yeah,
don't
yeah.
know.
No, I imagine I agree with you. I also think that the role of culture in language learning, and how when you take one word from one culture that is untranslatable, it's sort of like a peep into what's important
Yes,
in that
yes,
culture, right?
yes, definitely.
But yeah, I think for some people who are only looking for something that's more functional, it could be. And this guy was like, no, I don't think it's for English. I think everyone has to learn English because English is like the language, right? But he
Mhm,
said, I went to Thailand a couple of years ago, and I would have really liked to have like some buds that I could translate at the market or whatever. And it was
mhm.
completely functional. It was just like that
Yes.
day, and so but yeah, you mentioned language learning. What role do you think that gaming plays in language learning? Because when we started working in tech companies,
Mhm,
um, before that, we used to do evaluations, usually in more sort of classic business setting, in a multinational or whatever. And you went in, you did an evaluation, and everyone sort of fell in really standard places because it was really obvious that they had had formal teaching. Yeah. And when we started working in tech companies, suddenly like evaluations got much harder, and at one point I started thinking like, why am I having trouble like, putting people in, it was something that I could do like with my eyes closed in another setting. And I realized that a lot of it was because of gaming, because everyone was playing online, and so they had vocabulary, and sometimes they could speak and they had slang, but they had no grammar, and it
yep.
was really difficult to place people in levels because it was sort of really mixed. What role, if any, do you think that gaming plays in language learning, and what role could it play? Do you think?
um I would say that most of the English I know today, or the English I've heard across all my years, is from gaming and movies. Like, that's the two main sources of English for me. I didn't use much English when I was in high school. I mean, other than classes,
Yeah.
And my first jobs I didn't use English. So most of my English exposure comes from gaming and movies. So for me, gaming was very important, like from the get go, because it doesn't only show you vocabulary. I mean, why your sentences structured the way they are. I think that I have like another eye because I ended up studying
You're a
linguistics.
linguist.
So
Yeah.
yeah, but I think that any exposure you get being in gaming or whatever, it's gonna help you learn a different language. I mean, I think that's a given. The fact that if you play online gaming and the servers you're playing in are in the States, for example, and you're playing with a lot of people from the States, or I don't know, from whatever. I mean, maybe it can be from one of the British islands in the Caribbean or whatever. So you're exposed to that language and you're going to start to pick up things and you're going to start to hear more. You're going to start to, deduce how the language works, because that's how language is acquired when you're young. I mean, when you're a kid, you learn language by hearing it mostly. There's other things, but mostly comes from that. So why wouldn't that work when you're, a teenager and you're speaking to other people in another language, and maybe you're gonna start using some words that you both know, like gaming slang or whatever. But eventually things are gonna click, and you're gonna start picking up other things. So I think gaming can be really important if you know how to use it. If you are correctly, like if you're predisposed to it.
Yeah. If that's your mindset when you're actually playing and you
Yeah.
actually want to do it.
Yeah.
I have a last question
Okay.
regarding the use of AI and regarding sort of the globalization of language in general. What do you think the effect of AI is in linguistics in a more in a broader sort of cultural sense? Talking about having this, like I feel like as time goes by, there seems to be like a more globalized language and there less dialects. Do you think AI is going to have an effect on that or not? And what's your vision of this for now and possibly for the future?
That's interesting because a few months ago, I wrote an article, like an opinion piece for a newspaper, where I specifically said that I think that AI, especially like what ChatGPT is doing right now and what it's starting to become, I think that those kind of tools sort of destroy linguistic, like language variation. That's is exactly what you said. I mean, some dialects are disappearing, some dialects are going to disappear, definitely. And that's a huge, huge problem. Like, I think, because language is part of your identity. I don't imagine myself as a Uruguayan speaking Spanish like in a neutral way, like what the Mexicans and the Colombians try to do in some point with translations, like the neutral Spanish.
Yeah.
So I would imagine that AI sort of pushes that to the forefront. A sort of standardized English, a sort of diluted English, like something that it's completely void of any marks that could identify you as a person from the States, as a person from Britain, as a person from, I don't know, from Jamaica or from Trinidad and Tobago, whatever. So unless you specifically tell the AI to speak a certain way and to write a certain way, it's going to write in its most neutral, like very heavily quoted, because there's no such thing as neutral. There's always something behind your decision to write or to say things in a certain way. I mean, neutral Spanish is not actually neutral. It was made by Mexicans and Colombians. So from that point, those two identities are very heavily represented in that Spanish. And there's a lot of Spanish speakers that are not represented by that way of speaking. The same happens with English. I mean, many people in the States, there's I don't know how many different accents there are in the States, how many different dialects, but it's not the same to speak with someone from New York that to speak with someone from LA. It's not the same thing.
No.
And that's not even mentioning the difference between countries. But so I would imagine that AI is sort of it's very. It's very bad for language variation. And I, as a linguist, as a linguistic student, I find that very worrying. And the fact that AI is controlled by so little people, like there's two or three corporations in the world that control most of what of AI powered systems. So the fact that those few corporations are the ones that are controlling it, they have the power to either make a linguistic variation, like make a standardized English in the way they want, or they can make some variation of English completely disappear. And one of the first experiments I did with ChatGPT when it was first started to come out, I asked it questions about our Spanish, about Spanish from Uruguay and Argentina that are from the River Plate, from Rio de la Plata. So, and he got it all wrong. I mean, I say he, I don't like saying he, but it got it all wrong. It didn't tell me about all the influence we have from African dialects. I mean, we have a lot of words that are from slave town, and we have a lot of words that are from indigenous people, from the Charruas, from Chanas, or Guarani, or whatever. And ChatGPT didn't know about that stuff, or it didn't show you at first. Once you pushed it, it started to come out, but not at first. And that's sort of the thing. That same thing can happen for African Americans speaking English in the United States, or Native Americans speaking English in a certain way with certain words. So I think that, yeah, generative AI and all these advancements we're seeing in that field is very dangerous for linguistic, for dialects, for existing dialects, and some dialects that are almost about to disappear. And I think that's going to be like the final push. Yeah.
What do you think can be done? I mean, do you think if, for example, there is more development of AI, for example, in Latin American countries, or not having like your own AI built in, even if you're using some components from outside, do you think that could change something, or are we just fucked?
Yeah, I think that, we're mostly screwed, because there's no way you can, I mean, the way I see it, or the way I imagine it, is that I don't think that that's ever going to happen, because we don't have the necessary infrastructure, or we always rely on another corporation, or in a bigger country or whatever, that they have their own interests. And cultural preservation is not like the biggest worry of them. It's just not in their, it's not in their to-do list. It's not very important for them. So I would imagine that we're sort of screwed in that sense. Yeah.
All right. Well, on that happy note.
Yeah. Yeah.
Francisco Villaverde, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you. It was really fun.